would you say were some of your greatest challenges while you were growing up?
Probably, not knowing if you're going to have a decent meal, this night, or, a lot of the times not having a place to stay for the most part growing up. Just, a lot of struggles, and, having to overcome a lot of those things to get to this point. It was really, a dramatic change in my life, and knowing where I came from, to be here now is truly remarkable.
Amen to that. I always think when we see people go through difficult situations, there are two groups of people. There are those who say, this is my lot in life, I can't do anything better, and they just decide, I'm going to figure out how to survive in this situation. Yeah. And then there are those who say, I am determined to get out. Which one were you?
I was a part of the determined group, because, I wasn't going to be mad at the world. I wasn't going to get mad at, the people around me for being in this situation. I was put there for a reason, and, I didn't let that hold me down. And I didn't know that it was a better, life on the other side, but I would watch, the NFL and the NBA on TV, and I would say, they had to get there for a reason. So I wasn't going to get involved in the drugs, the gangs and the violence. And, I stayed away from that. And, I knew, if I did those things, I wasn't going to, get to where I wanted to be. So, I just kept fighting, and, I knew the road was going to be, tough, but, I figured I could handle it, and I just kept at it, stayed, with it, and got to where I wanted to be. And, I'll never, one day wake up and say, I'm supposed to be here, because, I know where I once was, and it's unbelievable that, I'm here today.
No regrets, right?
No regrets.
So beyond determination, you had a plan.
Yeah.
Professional sports. Why did you decide to have that specific plan?
That's all I knew. I didn't see people getting up every day, going to work, going to school. I got up on my own to go to school and things like that. And, I knew, if I could be a professional athlete, that'll be great. But, I really wanted to get out, my environment I was in.
Yeah. One of the things I thought was really interesting when I was reading the book was you talked about why you were motivated to do those things. It wasn't just, you didn't want to just play professional sports just to have the money, but you wanted to be able to have some basic needs met that you hadn't had.
Yeah.
There are millions of children, I'm sure, probably around the world who are in very similar circumstances or have just come out of those circumstances. Yeah. They didn't know, where their next meal was going to come from, or if they were going to have a roof over their heads the next day. What are some practical things that they could do that you've learned along the way through your own experience?
I tried to find, positive people, to stay away from the negative people. And, once I found some good mentors and, people to look up to, and people who had decent jobs and things like that. And, I looked up to those people, and, I just stayed positive and, said to myself, I have to, get where they are.
Yeah, so I guess there were two elements then, you being determined, and then I guess also having positive influences in your life. Yeah. What about the group that we talked about earlier who really aren't very motivated at all? They just think this is the situation I'm in. What could they do, or what would you say to them to encourage them?
I was once in that group, until I, figured out, I wanted to change, and I didn't necessarily have to have a wealthy family come take me in, or, do some big deal to get a lot of money. I was going to make it regardless, like I said. And, I just tell them, stay positive, and, if you want it to happen, it can happen. I mean, it's going to be tough, yeah, but everybody would do it if it was easy. I mean, it can never get worse than it is, and so.
Yeah. Let me ask you, we talked about some of the different things that help to keep you encouraged, but what role did your actual faith play in your, your success story going from poverty to the pros?
Always praying, praying a lot, and, having faith in God, and knowing that, without Him, none of this would be possible. A lot of other people get credit for this and that, but without Him, it wouldn't be possible. stuff like this just doesn't happen. It's one in a billion for me going from where I am to the NFL and professional athlete. That just really doesn't happen. So, but for as everybody else is not going to get a chance to be a professional athlete. You can be anything else. I mean, there's thousands of jobs out there for you. So. Yeah.
That's true, because, a lot of young people will probably watch this, especially young men, and think, my way out will be, some type of professional sport. Right. But there are other things you're saying that they could focus on. Is there something specific that they should tap into, I guess, to determine what it is they would want to do with their lives?
I was good at sports, so, I took that route and I focused on that. So it's just knowing what you're good at and looking yourself in the mirror and, coming to reality.